author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Investigative historian A. Saman warned that guns are a necessary tool designed to help your people avoid a repeat of history. And yet today, with near constant attacks on the Second Amendment, America is at risk of losing rights that make the nation truly acceptable. But all may not be lost. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's edition, we talk about the attacks on the Second Amendment and the crumbling economy under Joe Biden's leadership. Now, I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hagerstown, Maryland on WARK 1490 AM and 98.9 FM. Thank you for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Through the trials and tribulations of Joe Biden's inflation extravaganza, the administration has clung to one number: jobs. In spite of the cost of living crisis, exorbitant price hikes, the White House has reliably been able to say that job numbers are doing well. But all that has changed. Now, we're joined by Liberty Nation's economics guru and editor, Andrew Moran, to delve into the latest figures. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to have to start adding the only man who can wear a nice wool vest properly as well, because you carry it with aplomb. Now, Andrew, what do the latest job numbers tell us, and what do they signify?
Well, they do show that the U.S. labor market is finally starting to slow down. Even heading into the Bureau of Labor Statistics March jobs report, you saw a lot of the other figures showing easing in the red hot labor market. You saw the challenger job cuts surge 319% year over year. You saw the ISM manufacturing PMI sub-index employment one start slowing down. You saw the private sector payroll growth come down. Even within the March jobs report, there were a lot of either flat or lost jobs in various sectors of the economy, which has been completely different from the last year when you saw pretty much robust, diverse, broad growth in the broader U.S. labor economy.
Let's delve into this and pretend that I'm an idiot for a moment, just for the sake of...
I can't pretend that. I'm sorry, I can't.
So what this means, I figure, is that there are less jobs available. The ones that are available tend to be low growth jobs. Is that right?
Well, so let's pick apart those two facts first. So first, job openings actually fell below 10 million. That's the first time in about 2 years. So that was remarkable to see that. And the second part, within the March jobs report, you see a lot of sustenance jobs growth. So for example, leisure and hospitality usually leads the way in these March jobs reports. So you're absolutely correct that there was fewer jobs, and then the jobs that did rise were a result for the sustenance economy. Plus, also government jobs added about, I think it was 46,000 positions to that labor market report. And also, once again, there was a divergence between the household and the establishment surveys by about 100,000. So I think those are key points to reference.
That divergence in the two figures that people will cite whichever one best suits their argument, I guess, but the divergence there, we have talked about this before, but that comes from one of them counts if somebody has 3 jobs, like they do an Uber and a DoorDash, and maybe they have another job, that counts as 3 more people are employed, whereas it's only one person basically scrabbling for what equates to a single paycheck. Is that about right?
Correct. And also, I would just like to add that if you dive deeper into the March jobs report, you see that the number of people working 2 or more jobs is actually, once again, it rose, and it touched around 8 million people working 2 or more jobs. That's also worth mentioning in this economic environment.
Okay, now and
if I may add one more point, is
Please.
that you see that they're taking these 2 or more jobs because average weekly earnings based on the March CPI report is still negative. It's negative 1.6%. So you have 24 straight months of sub-zero wage growth for U.S. workers, which is completely baffling.
Well, that's actually what I want to delve into. So you have 24 straight months of sub-zero. Now, does that mean that it's a wage that hasn't kept up with inflation?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah,
the actual
inflation-adjusted
number,
real wage.
the number on the paycheck hasn't changed. The number on the paycheck has actually gone up, but it hasn't gone up enough to counteract inflation.
Exactly. I think, Mark, you should be the new economics editor. If I ever die, you should be.
Well, let's hope that never happens. Well, maybe not never, right? Who wants to live forever? Uh, the Highlander, perhaps. Now, how will these figures, do you think, impact the wider economy?
Well, I'm trying to think of that question. I'm sorry. How will that impact the wider economy?
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to know. We have jobs numbers dropping, but that's always the job numbers have kept the markets buoyed, right? They've been, whenever there's been inflation issues or something, which have been constant over the last 2 years, let's be fair. But the markets have always said, well, there's still the jobs. That still points to a healthy economy. But has this flattened the market growth?
Well, this is actually good news. I mean, if a slowing labor market is good news for the broader economy based on the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve sees a slowing labor market, which it keeps blaming for higher inflation, then it's gonna ease off its tightening efforts. And when you have easy monetary policy, that's better for an economy that is 2/3 consumption, that is mostly fueled by borrowing. So yeah, so in a way, that is good for an economy based on what the Federal Reserve does and its monetary policy efforts.
So it's good for broader economy, not so good for the individuals.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, U.S. labor market, I mean, it's been extremely tight. A lot of people have been employed, but the problem are many fronts. One is that it's completely fallen behind on inflation. Two is that it's starting to slow down now. Three, there are many pockets of the economy, of the labor market showing weakness. So, for example, one area of the economy that Joe Biden keeps saying, oh, manufacturing is coming back. But manufacturing has not only been in a recession, but the labor market has been weakening over the last few months. So I think those are worthwhile points to discuss when we talk about the broader labor market itself.
Speaking of President Joe Biden, are there any numbers that the administration or Karine Jean-Pierre herself can point to buoy confidence within the administration?
Yeah, well, right away. I mean, for sure that President Joe Biden or Karine Jean-Pierre, they're going to release statements talking about lower inflation. Look how our Inflation Reduction Act has allowed inflation to ease to 5%. And you and I discussed this late last year, predicting that, yeah, inflation is going to come down just because of that elevated baseline effect when you had of 9.1% in June, that of course is going to ease on a year-over-year basis with disinflation. But it's not because of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's mainly because of the baseline effect and the Federal Reserve's monetary tightening. So it has nothing to do with fiscal policy, because if you look at the monthly deficits, they've been surging again. They've been rising entirely. So this whole deficit reduction that's going to fight inflation is nonsense. The administration has done anything at all for the inflation front.
It reminds me of George Orwell's 1984, where over the tannoy it comes in that we're increasing your chocolate ration to 4 ounces this week. Up from 3 ounces, when in fact it was 5 ounces last week, and there's actually a reduction, but it looks like it's going up because the official announcements come out. Now, one more question on this, Andrew. Do you see anything that the government is doing presently that can counteract this recent downturn?
No, I mean, not at all. I mean, it's exactly what they're going to do is what governments have done in the before. Is that if a recession does happen, and if it's sharp and it's broad, the government's going to intervene, have all the stimulus, raise the deficits, hand out money. That's all it does. I mean, instead of allowing a recession to filter throughout the economy, annihilate all of the nonsense that has been filtered since the coronavirus pandemic, governments do the exact opposite and just and have money come from the helicopter and just shower every single sector, particularly the green sector, with just taxpayer-funded handouts and deficit-financed spending bills.
So more free money from the Fed, right? Nothing, no such thing as a free lunch.
Well, what's funny is that during the International Monetary Fund, the spring meetings, one journalist actually asked, your report said you expect interest rates to come back down to pre-pandemic levels and essentially free money. And they said, yeah, we expect that not only in the United States, but economies everywhere. And then you're going to have this vicious cycle where you have inflation, you have, malinvestment going on, you have moral hazards. I mean, if artificial low interest rates are not great as many people expect, especially when you have to counteract that with rising interest rates with the myriad of problems that fester from having artificial low interest rates.
And we're going to be talking about the possibility of a recession after this short break. We'll be back with Andrew Moran. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
From general poo-pooing to outright denying such a thing is possible, it seems that the R word, recession, has once again reared its ugly head. Now, what does this mean for markets and the average family? What are the indicators and how deep will it likely go? Well, we're back with Andrew Moran to answer these questions and hopefully a few more. Andrew, I thought talk of recession was in the rearview mirror, that it was all just vertigo, and any other Hitchcock reference you care to make.
Yeah, heading into 2023, recession talk had died down, but then a couple of things happened on the way to the dreaded R word. One was that the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and then a lot of the data heading actually into SVB. So you look at some of the February numbers like construction spending and factory orders, that's actually declined. And this all happens before the banking crisis. So really you have to monitor what happens over the next few weeks and a couple of months based on the data front and how the economy responds to the banking turmoil.
So I remember last year we had literally everybody in the fourth estate, most people, I should say, not everybody, but many of the fourth estate outlets were poo-pooing the idea that a recession was even possible, even though the technical factors had been met. They pointed to, as we've talked about in the earlier segment here, the jobs numbers and how that mitigates what would otherwise create a technical recession. What are they saying now?
Well, now, I mean, in the aftermath of SVB and Signature, most economists have raised their recession odds. I mean, you look at even Goldman Sachs, which I call it a perma bull, it raised its recession odds from 25 to 35%. And you look at some of the numbers too, the Atlanta Fed Bank GDP Now model estimate, which is a pretty reliable measurement. It lowered its estimate to 1.5% for the first quarter. And overall for the rest of the year, I mean, look at the IMF's recent GDP outlook, and has about 1.6%. So even if you don't have a recession, you're still going to have inevitably a stagflation environment, which again is a talk of the town once again. Mohamed El-Erian, he's been talking about that, and you have lackluster economic growth with still elevated inflation. So either it's recession or stagflation. Pick your poison.
It sounds almost like Shakespearean, doesn't it? It's a recession by any other name would smell as sweet, but you're just changing. It's a recessionary factors without the technical recession.
And also, if you can look at some sectors of the economy too. So I mentioned in our previous segment about manufacturing. Manufacturing is in a recession itself. Many of the leading indicators in this industry has been weakening, whether it's labor, whether it's output, new orders, whatever the case. So and then the banking sector, that could inevitably also be in a recession based on the inevitable credit crunch that's been or the data showing a credit crunch anyway. So yeah, so maybe not a national recession. Maybe I think actually they call it. There was actually a rolling recession, I think it was, whereby maybe not the entire United States economy, but various pockets of the marketplace would be in a recession. I think I wrote about that for Liberty Nation a couple of months ago.
Now, the Bank of America, they released a series of charts. Now, basically the idea of those charts was a series of key indicators that tell us that a recession is either here or on its way. What do they tell us overall?
Well, essentially that a recession is coming. I mean, one of the key recession indicator that most investors monitor, and the other complementary measurement that the Fed monitors, is the inverted yield curve. So in those PMI charts in the Bank of America charts you shared with me, one of them was a 2-year, 10-year Treasury yield curve inversion. So that was from the last time, it's negative 62 basis points. And then if you look at the Fed's preferred, which is a 3-month, 10-year yield curve inversion, it's about 167 basis points last time I checked. But there was one of those charts that I disagreed with. One was at the manufacturing PMI. Now, yes, it's absolutely correct that the manufacturing PMI has been slowing down in contraction territory for a while. The problem is that manufacturing now only accounts for 11% of GDP. Now, can that lead the country into recession? I don't exactly concede. I don't exactly know that, but we overemphasize manufacturing. I mean, yeah, you can argue whether U.S. still needs manufacturing or not, but if the manufacturing is a key indicator of the slowing economy, I can't agree with that assessment. But overall, those charts from Bank of America are accurate. I see those charts all the time. I see the data numbers frequently, and yeah, they're accurate. So yeah, that's a recession. Its forecast of recession is accurate.
So, Andrew, do you think that now that pretty much everybody's agreed that the recession's there on the horizon, we're fast approaching it, do you think that the de-dollarization campaign that's been taking place around the world, all these different countries doing their contracts in other currencies, do you think that's going to add to the issue?
No, not at all. The de-dollarization campaign, and I've been asked about this frequently on radio and television, is that this is a long-term problem that's going to cause a lot of headaches for the United States economy. So I'll leave people like Dave Patterson, our national security correspondent, talk about the geopolitical consequences of de-dollarization. But from an economic standpoint, the long-term consequences are severe. I mean, let's go to a timeline, for example, here. So in 1922 or 1928, excuse me, the U.S. pretty much displaced the pound sterling as a chief international reserve currency. By 1944, the U.S. dollar had become the chief international reserve currency. It exacerbated after Nixon got off the gold standard in 1971. Since then, the U.S. has exported so many dollars throughout the global financial system. Many countries have in their forex reserves, they have it in their bank accounts, all that stuff. The problem is that the U.S. has been able to export its inflation for that long. If these countries decide that, okay, fine, we don't want to deal with dollars anymore, we don't need as many dollars anymore, we want to deal with won and rubles and reals, that, okay, we can ship back now the U.S. dollars into the United States economy. That would create an inflationary headache just because of the fact that the U.S. currently has about $21 trillion of currency in circulation. Let's say the foreign debt is about $12 trillion. That money goes back into the U.S. economy. You're going to have hyperinflation. And it's not just me saying that. I mean, there's a great economist, E.J. Antoni. He wrote for Heritage, and he talked about that exact same thing. Is the U.S. has been able to export inflation for the last couple of decades, and the de-dollarization is that thing that's going to destroy the U.S. dollar. That's going to end the dollar hegemony. And then you have what goes in its place. You have perhaps the won. You have a basket of BRICS currencies. So there are many options to go out. Some people say a gold-backed currency, but that I can't. It'd be nice, but I don't see that happening ever. A gold-backed currency.
So simply, I think what you're saying here, Andrew, is that we've got either super inflation or recession. Pick your poison.
Well, as I talked about over the last 12 months, is that the recession will kill inflation because what the Fed has been doing is to kill demand, and it's been killing demand. I mean, you see a lot of the numbers, you see a lot of consumption levels have been tapering off. So yeah, the recession would kill the inflation. But I mean, you're trying to conflate the two issues, whereby the de-dollarization is either going to ignite the recession or inflation. But long term is the inflation problem. And I think I mentioned this in your show a few weeks ago, talking about, I think the more plausible scenario is you have a situation in the 1980s and 1990s where it looked like Paul Volcker, the Fed chair at the time, vanquished inflation by 1986, but then it started rearing its ugly head again, and then you had a situation of ebb and flow inflation. And then it wasn't until about the mid 90s that inflation was around the Fed's 2% target rate.
Inflation Back to the Future edition. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The perilous state of the Second Amendment in America is once again dominating headlines. Whether it's Joe Biden's rhetoric on weapons of war or states taking action against the nebulous term assault weapons, it seems that the right to bear arms cannot catch a break. Now, we're fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's editor-at-large, Jim Fight, who is our fount of all knowledge on all things firearms. Welcome back to the show, Jim.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
So, Jim, let's start off examining the language that politicians use to decry the Second Amendment and the associated facets of it. What is, in your professional opinion, an assault weapon?
Oh, it's a boogeyman. Assault weapon is the term assault weapon and the related term assault rifle, which I highlight for a moment for a reason you'll see here in just a moment. It is a fear-mongering propaganda term, right? Like it is designed specifically to create a straw man. The illusion of the image of Americans armed with AR-15s or AK variants as these radical militants that are a threat to their neighbors. And the way it works is, this is, by the way, not a real term. Like, it's not a real firearms term. It's completely made up by left-wing politicians. But there is a real firearms term called the battle rifle. And a battle rifle is the actual military rifle, which is usually a select fire rifle, which means that you can swap through modes of firing. So you've got a semi-automatic, or you might have a 3-round burst, or a fully automatic. So it's sort of that transition between what we would call a semi-automatic sporting rifle or home defense rifle. It's sort of the transition between that and a full auto all the time machine gun.
Okay. So assault weapon. I mean, it's used so often, even when people are discussing laws, gun control laws specifically.
Right.
And I think this bothers so many people because it's a dog whistle to those who don't really understand anything about weapons. And I'm sure
it really is. I just want to highlight real quick. There's actually a common misconception that AR stands for assault rifle.
When we all have
Armalite Rifle is the company that made it.
We happen to know that AR-15 stands for Arizona. No, and
That's it. Yeah. How many Arizonans can be shot in a second?
AK-47 means it was made in Arkansas, right? Is that
Alaska?
Alaska.
AR is actually Arkansas, and AZ is Arizona.
There you go. Yeah. So Alaska and Arkansas. So yeah, they use this language, assault weapon, when they're speaking about writing legislation, and surely that should disqualify anybody from writing legislation if they can't use a specific term. They're using a made-up term that has no particular definition. And surely that way lies the tyranny of lawfare, doesn't it?
Oh, I would say so. I wrote for Liberty Nation. Man, I don't even remember when it was. It was several years ago. An article that I titled something along the lines of "We need more gunsplaining," and I made the argument in that article that you don't have to understand guns. That's, I won't impose a hobby or an advocacy on anyone. Like, I don't really care about knitting, so I didn't learn about knitting. But if you intend to write laws on the subject, yeah, you're obligated to understand it, I think.
Knit one, pearl one. Absolutely. You're talking about firearms here, not knitting, presumably. Now, Jim.
Well, I mean, hey, look, if you want to write laws on knitting, learn knitting.
Absolutely. Now, Washington state lawmakers, they're pushing an effort to prohibit, I think it's the sale, manufacture, and import of what they term assault weapons. Now, what specifically is this proposed legislation saying?
Well, a few things, and this will kind of work as partial answer to both your original question and this question. I'll read you the direct quote from the legislation. It's not very long, of how the legislation defines an assault weapon. So it says, quote, "Assault weapons are civilian versions of weapons created for the military and are designed to kill humans quickly and efficiently. For this reason, the legislature finds that assault weapons are like M16 rifles and are thus weapons most useful in military service," where they added quotes to the things that I added emphasis to. And of course, the problem with that is, again, that distinction between a rifle that can actually fire fully automatic or 3-round burst as opposed to only semi-automatic. These are not military rifles. They kind of look like military rifles, so I guess give them that much. But it also, they're also, it's for the most part, it's standard assault weapon ban fare. Mostly cosmetic stuff. Not everything's cosmetic, but mostly it's cosmetic stuff. Although one thing actually did stand out to me, and that was they banned the thumbhole stock. And what the thumbhole stock What that means is, I guess, I mean, the only thing that comes to me is what's called a sporting stock,
Right.
which is it's a wooden stock. It doesn't have like a pistol grip. It's kind of like a conventional rifle stock, but it has a grooved section in the butt stock where your shooting hand, you can get your thumb wedged in and get a better grip on it. And it's actually it was designed for hunters to increase accuracy over long range shots.
So essentially,
So it's not really a mass shooting kind of thing. It's more like a let me make sure I kill this deer humanely kind of thing.
let me just check you on this, Jim. Does that mean that the proposed legislation here is actually seeking to ban something that would make somebody shooting a firearm more dangerous because they would have less control over the precision pointing of the barrel?
There, you've hit it. You've hit it, Mark. I was grinning when you started to say that because I knew that's where you were going with it. That's exactly one of the things that blows my mind about some of these laws. I kind of see where they're coming from. They want to hinder your ability, well, not your ability, but they want to hinder a violent criminal's ability to target someone and take them out. The problem with that is every time you fire a round, it's going somewhere. So if it doesn't hit your intended target, who or what does it hit?
This is precisely why all the best gun ranges, outdoor gun ranges, have huge hillocks behind the targets, because the bullet's going to go somewhere.
Absolutely. It's also why nobody stands down range and points and goes, "Hey, shoot right here." Like,
yeah, I've never seen anybody stand down range, although I have seen people come close on an archery range, which was worrying enough. Now, what is the state of this proposed legislation? Now, I believe currently it's ready to head to Governor Jay Inslee. Now, based on his past record, would you say that he's likely to sign it into law?
I think it's likely. His stance on the Second Amendment, he has said in the past that, quote, gun violence is a public health crisis. Arming teachers is ridiculous. And he has actually, as recently as January of this year, advocated banning assault weapons. So there's your answer right there. Of course, he's going to sign this bill.
Right. Okay. And so we can presume that Washington State will then, it seems to, sorry, Jim, I'm being a bit nebulous here, but it seems to me that the language of the proposed legislation could be in itself nebulous, and therefore is likely to be challenged in numerous instances through the courts, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely. I mean, I suppose I should use my weasel words, as they say, and say it will probably be challenged. Yeah. But I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that this law will be challenged.
Yeah,
I mean, now how successful that challenge will be, we'll find out. But
all depends on which circuit it ends up in, I guess. Now, Jim, are there any other efforts around the country that are prominent right now about banning firearm sales or restricting ownership?
Yeah. So right now, of course, you always want to look at New York and California. Those are kind of givens. The Bruin decision notwithstanding, but I suppose we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But at the moment, Colorado is also considering a similar ban. So Colorado, Washington will probably be the next state to have an assault weapons ban of some sort. Colorado may very well follow suit soon. Of course, Delaware passed a so-called assault weapons ban back in June of last year, and Illinois actually January of this year. So
well, with Delaware, I'm not too surprised, because apparently they have a problem with angry old dudes firing shotguns in the air.
Right, double barrel, yeah, both barrels,
both barrels,
completely emptying it into the air, which is in itself a crime.
Yes, but of course, it only matters when people who aren't the present president of the United States do it. Now, after this short break, we'll be back with James Fight discussing the ever-progressing state of concealed carry laws in the United States. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Earlier in the show, Jim Fight and I were talking about the new gun restrictions across the nation. But now I want to shift in the opposite direction and to see the other side of the equation. Now, Jim, am I right in thinking that Florida is now a state with concealed carry laws fresh on the books?
Yeah. The newest state to join the what a lot of people are calling the constitutional carry movement, which I mean it's going to vary from state by state, of course, but the simple nuts and bolts of it is the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is the only permit you need to conceal carry.
Okay, so what does that mean specifically for Floridians? What can they now do? Or I believe the law comes into effect on July 1st. I might be wrong on that. But what will they be able to do on July 1st that they're unable to do on June 30?
Right. So what they can do once this law goes into effect, and hey, disclaimer, don't start acting differently until the law goes into effect.
Absolutely.
But anyways, what Floridians will be able to do differently is they'll no longer be required to go and get a concealed carry permit in order to carry a weapon concealed. And of course, that's pretty basic. But what it comes down to is that means you cut out the bureaucracy involved. You cut out the additional expense of any sort of training requirement or filing fees or anything to that effect. You cut out the wait time, and you get straight to the matter of if you were otherwise legally allowed to carry a firearm in the state of Florida. Again, another important distinction. Don't walk out of the prison gates one day and think, hey, it's con carry, I'll just go grab me a pistol, because you'll be right back in prison before you know it. But yeah, if you're otherwise legally allowed to carry a firearm in Florida, you can just do so now. Okay.
Now, I think there is a fair bit of confusion over why concealed carry is so contentious. Now, this largely comes, I believe, from a bit more of a Fourth Estate full-on campaign against the idea of constitutional carry, as it's known, as in the authors of these pieces, and in fact many lawmakers, feel it will be a wild, wild west with people having showdowns in the middle of the street at high noon. What's your take on it?
Before I really answer that, I want to jump in on the Wild Wild West thing.
Yes, yeah, I knew you'd catch me on that because obviously despite everybody, Robert Heinlein, the sci-fi author, once said, "An armed society is a polite society," and so the idea that the Wild Wild West was in fact gunfights at the OK Corral every Sunday afternoon is obviously not quite true. It's not true based on what we know historically.
Right. Do you remember the show Punk'd?
I do not.
Okay, I think it was an MTV show. Anyways, celebrities would go and do ridiculous things to other celebrities, and but anyways, and of course it was all pranks. But the idea was to catch him on camera and not realizing it was a prank. And one day, I was a teenager and I was riding around my dad. My dad, we were talking about guns, and basically he was giving me the sound advice for anyone. By the way, is that if you see someone on the street, assume they're armed. Don't assume they aren't armed. Assume they are armed. And he said, there's a reason that they never filmed an episode of Punk'd in the rural South. And but so to kind of a modern take on Heinlein's quote, but no, there's a reason that we only have a handful of Western movies based on legitimate actual shootouts in the street, right?
Yeah.
Why did the shootout at the OK Corral get redone so many times? Because there was only a handful of them in history.
Yeah,
it was not as common as the anti-gun left would have us believe.
Okay, so back to the question there.
Oh yes, back to the question.
Would be ideal.
Sorry, I rabbit trailed there. No, so I think that the real source of the controversy here is fear. It's the same reason that we see, as we spoke about earlier, on the other side of the coin, states passing bans on what they consider to be assault weapons, and I think there are a few camps that people fall into. There are some who legitimately don't understand. They know nothing about guns, and when they hear some politician or some activist or some activist journalists say something along the lines of, "Oh, this guy, carried out a mass shooting with a ghost gun, or he, this rifle has and this is a slightly paraphrased actual quote from a Colorado legislator, by the way, has a, what do you say, 30 caliber clip, which we'll blow past that for the moment, capable of shooting, did he say 600 or 700 rounds per second? I don't know. But anyways, it was some ridiculous thing that we don't even have the tech for, and just butchered all the terms. But they hear that and they don't know any better.
Yeah.
Because they don't know the stuff.
Picking up on your point there about fear, I think that the fear would be assuaged somewhat if people were aware that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, used to, I don't believe they do anymore, but they used to track defensive uses of firearms. And I believe that the last time I checked the figures, there was roughly 2.5 million defensive uses of firearms in the nation on a yearly basis. And to me, that sounds like a safer thing than, let's say there are 50,000 violent gun crimes per year across the country. Although I know a lot of the figures there are suicides.
Roughly 35 to 40,000 every year of that figure is suicide.
Yeah. But if they realize that 2.5 million potential deaths, murders were prevented, or any other crime, really, violent beatings, sexual offenses, were prevented because of somebody defensively using a firearm, I think that would do a lot to alleviate the fear. But it seems that nobody really wants to discuss the defensive properties of a firearm, which
I agree, Mark.
Yeah.
I also think that if people thought about the fact of how many guns there are in America versus how many violent crimes committed with guns, they would realize, we think of guns as being the problem when less than 0.1% of the firearms in America are used in a crime.
Yeah, so it's education that's needed about firearms, really, to better secure the tenets of the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment. Now, one final quick question for you, Jim. After the Bruen decision, New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen came down from the Supreme Court, have we seen an uptick in pro-2A rulings?
We have, and we've seen them fairly close together, which I think is important. So, if you look back in
you're saying there's a good grouping of
yeah, I see what you did there, Mark. Yeah, there's a good grouping. The gun nerds listening to this will get a kick out of that. So the big, the obvious thing that changed with the Bruen decision was basically the so-called may issue permit laws, as opposed to shall issue permit laws, were a violation of the Second Amendment. So a shall issue permit law says, if you meet the qualifications, you will get the permit. May issue means if you meet the qualifications, you might get the permit.
Depending on the weather, yeah.
Yeah. And anyways, but perhaps more the broader reach of this ruling is that it changed the way judges have to examine a law versus the Second Amendment. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing new challenges. We're also seeing new challenges of old laws.
Okay, good stuff. Now, you can check out Jim's writings on these topics that we've been talking about. And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, James Fight and Andrew Moran, for being here. And of course, you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in. My parting shot for this week, I want to consider the words of James Madison, who said, "The Constitution preserves the advantage of being armed, which Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, where the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms." Now, I think this speaks to the heart of American exceptionalism. So few places in the world seem to think that a free person should be allowed to defend themselves from aggressors, attackers, and even from government tyranny. The idea that everyone can and should protect themselves was at the time both brave and revolutionary. And the fact is that today it still is. It is the cowards and the entrenched that would rather see you unarmed and at their mercy. Just something to ponder there. Thank you for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.